Not a single human rights treaty in history has been more widely and rapidly ratified than the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which recognizes and defines the child and their human rights. And today, over 35 years later, it remains that 196 of 197 UN members have both signed and ratified the convention. For context, this particular country in question prosecuted and created legislation against animal abuse long before they adopted any laws protecting children from the same. In its infancy, with an increasingly diverse population, families, culture, and life in general could vary quite a lot, and people just couldn't seem to agree on a universal definition of a child. And how can you expect to protect something without a general understanding of what it is you're trying to protect? One thing was understood, at least: animals were considered an asset, and assets were certainly worthy of protection. It should be noted, though, the United States had been organizing and dealing with these vulnerable groups from the very beginning. Disabled people, both adults and children, would be isolated and most often abused indefinitely in asylums, and often meeting them with an equally tragic fate. Orphanages actually didn't just hold children who'd lost their parents, they held children whose living parents otherwise couldn't take care of them. Not to mention the quote-unquote residential schools. The horrors that the United States put Native children and families through are endless. Essentially, from its inception, the US has heavily invested in some kind of organized ostracism, and by refusing to acknowledge humanity in its entirety, we've basically created a foundation in the profitability of the institutionalization of people, of human beings. We've realized that these institutions, all of these facilities that, largely due to a lack of regulation, could function extremely frugally, packed full of people for a whole laundry list of reasons for an indefinite amount of time, could actually be really great for the economy. This is not to suggest that the United States has had no legislation protecting children. Society and lawmakers have become increasingly aware, especially in the last several decades, and have taken action across the country to protect children. Though it has posed its own challenges, improvements in science and technology have been helpful in that goal. And through research, we continue to learn about human development and psychology and apply our findings. We've used this to further our understanding of the vulnerabilities of children and how to best help and defend them. What's even more is that corruption and misconduct is easier than ever to survey, and information is available at our fingertips in an instant, meaning word travels very, very fast. Still, while we've made strides in recognizing and protecting children, there is a lasting and troubling contradiction. Under the established goal of protecting our vulnerable youth, an insidious and lucrative industry has emerged and firmly latched itself into society, largely unnoticed. Thousands of facilities operating under the facade of healing and rehabilitation for troubled or struggling youth exist across the United States, and even outside of the United States, which are not only unregulated and unchecked, but are inherently detrimental to the very development that they claim to support. This conglomerate of congregate care facilities does not have a formal name, but it's commonly referred to as the troubled teen industry. Before we actually look into the industry's impact on youth development, I should specify exactly what I'm talking about here. The entire history of the troubled teen industry, or TTI, as we know it today, could and should be a video of its own, so for the sake of the purpose of this video, I'll do my best to define the most current understanding of what the TTI is. The American Bar Association defines the TTI as, quote, a network of private youth programs, therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, religious academies, wilderness programs, and drug rehabilitation centers, including boot camps, correctional centers, and group homes, operated by private companies, nonprofits, or faith-based groups, and they promise to help youth with problems related to behavior, addiction, and eating disorders, and in some cases, sexual orientation and gender identity. Programs utilize a variety of methods that are often punitive, lack supporting evidence, and are centered around the idea of tough love. Without federal regulation and with extremely limited state oversight, allegations of abuse and neglect are commonplace, and there have been numerous preventable deaths. For the same reason, the exact statistics themselves are unknown, but it is estimated that each year the industry holds between 120,000 and 200,000 children and receives $23 million in public funds. So obviously, money is a factor. As society, technology, the economy, and politics have evolved, so has the industry of institutionalization. Today, programs and their owners can easily take advantage of the several moral panics that exist in part as a lingering effect of the war on drugs in the 70s and 80s. At the time, a substance abuse rehabilitation program called Straight Inc. was praised or promoted by both the Reagan and Bush presidential administrations. After an extensive history of lawsuits and abuse allegations, the state did eventually deny Straight Inc.'s operating license, and they were forced to shut their doors in the early 1990s. Still, there were hundreds of programs that opened for business or remained open whose practices were directly inspired by or suspiciously reminiscent of Straight Inc.'s abusive methods, which, by the way, were just iterations of former abusive programs like the infamous Synanon cult. As I was saying, detailing the entire history of the industry merits its own video, but it's important to understand the context because although today's programs use the same harmful practices as before, they aren't packaged the same because the issues of today aren't the same. At least two facts that remain consistent are that the business is inherently lucrative and that the very foundation of these programs is not evidence-based, nor does it take into consideration the psychological and developmental needs of the child. It's crucial that we first acknowledge that the rights of children are clearly less protected by law, to the extent that the constitutional right to protection against cruel and unusual punishment is not in fact awarded to children. Though many laws exist prohibiting the abuse and neglect of children, they are given no inherent human rights in the eyes of the law. Gentle reminder, the United States has yet to ratify the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child, which would address exactly that problem. It's also very important to note that the first piece of federal legislation protecting children in specific kinds of congregate care facilities within the TTI was only signed into law in December of 2024. That's just like 6-7 months ago. The Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act established a federal work group to oversee and collect data on youth residential treatment facilities, which they will use to interpret and make recommendations. Nothing like this existed before. There is still a lot of work to be done, but this was a notable change. And to be clear, no other federal regulation on the TTI exists. Otherwise, the responsibility falls to the states, whose laws around licensing and accreditation vary greatly, if they exist at all. Even when facilities are accredited, they're often inadequately supervised or even left entirely unchecked. Reports of neglect, abuse, and even death are frequent, even with increased attention from the media and legislators. Where is the quality control? The only consistent thing when it comes to regulation in the TTI is inconsistency, and this becomes that much muddier when you consider protected faith-based programs or crossing state lines with quote-unquote transportation services, unlovingly referred to by the survivor community as gooning. So these are some patterns we're seeing emerge from the very beginning of the booming business of institutionalization. They've managed to survive the test of time. The inability to agree upon a common definition of a child, the use of antiquated and unvalidated methods, the lack of regulation and oversight, the lucrative nature of the business in general, and to be frank, the lasting unmet needs of struggling families and children. Obviously, things have changed over time, and we have built upon some of the knowledge we've acquired. But take a look at almost any given program that exists today that could be considered part of the TTI, and you can trace its lineage back to the same origins, which actually go back much farther than the relatively recent war on drugs. If today's programs are almost just as unregulated as they have been since the beginning, they share the same goals and utilize methods inspired by notoriously abusive programs, how much better could things really be for our youth today? To recap, we know that children are not protected by the Constitution and are not allotted the same human rights under the law. This poses an issue, obviously, when it comes to regulating the safety of children as a whole. So what are the options given to us when a youth is struggling, whether that be from addiction, disability, mental health, behavioral concerns, or otherwise just in need of support? Recent research has shown that programs like DARE, Just Say No, are not effective. And some research even suggests that Scared Straight and similar programs may actually increase the probability of that kind of risky and often criminal behavior. Research is also showing the benefits of harm reduction techniques, a more educational and less restrictive alternative to the fear-based conditioning methods of the aforementioned programs. It's clear that punitive and fear or consequence-related conditioning is not as effective. It's also been acknowledged that when it comes to the care of children with disabilities, the least restrictive environment is most beneficial. This essentially means that it is best for youth with disabilities to be educated alongside their peers, including their non-disabled peers, as much as is appropriate for them. To forcefully remove a child from their peers without genuine, reasonable, and appropriate cause can be detrimental to their development. Research shows that children who who are educated inclusively alongside their non-disabled peers have better educational, social, and behavioral outcomes, even as they go into adulthood. Consider what psychologists understand about the stages of psychosocial human development, and stay with me here because this is all relevant. Psychologist Erik Erikson developed his widely recognized stages of psychosocial development in the 1950s to identify and analyze 8 stages of human development throughout the lifetime as they're impacted by psychology, biology, and social factors. Keep in mind that most accepted psychological and social theories are based on an extremely Western demographic, so I should just put that disclaimer out there. The ages of youth held in the TTI ranges mostly between 10 and 18 years of age. There are 2 stages of Erikson's theory which mainly overlap with those ages, which is the school age period with a core conflict of industry versus inferiority, and the period of adolescence with the core conflict of identity versus identity confusion. In the school age period of a person's life between the ages of around 5 and 12 years old, one is preoccupied mostly with school, with their peers, their friends, and learning some personal skills. Erikson noted that with support at home and in school, a well-developed child develops a core sense of competency at this time. They form confidence in their abilities and they're not entirely derailed by failure. However, when there is insufficient familial or educational support, when peer connections are unstable or in the presence of a consistent negative feedback, whether real or imagined, a child can develop the opposite, a core sense of inferiority and insecurity in themselves. If anything, this can be taken as more evidence that removing a child from their peers or their educational environment or familial support and placing them in a punitive, mistake, or failure-oriented conditions for behavioral modification purposes, or really any purpose, can be harmful to the developing mind. Then, in the adolescent period of a person's life, roughly between the ages of 12 and 18 years old, the developing mind is occupied by, you can guess it, themselves. Not necessarily in a narcissistic way, the mind is still growing and is attempting to grasp a sense of identity, their values, goals, and desires, their own role in the world, because they're about to step into it themselves for the first time. Peer influence is significant at this stage, and individuals may experiment to find what kind of ideas and behaviors align most with their beliefs and goals. Erikson identified that ideally, with appropriate freedom and support to explore, a person develops a strong core sense of personal identity. But when their interactions with society have been inappropriately restricted, or if they are overwhelmed by what they encounter or experience, a person can develop a sense of identity confusion, leading them to feel unsure of themselves, develop a core sense of lack of belonging, and are otherwise dissuaded from participating in society. To be clear, youth's developing minds require a certain extent of permission to exist imperfectly. Prohibiting this, forcing or restricting the maturing mind's ability to explore and exist in the world to either extreme extent can severely inhibit a person's psychological and social development. Now we have context on what's generally considered, at least in the professional field, to be developmentally appropriate for a developing mind. Bear with me here, but I will now ask you to consider what makes a cult. When I say the word, I'm sure several examples come to mind: the tragedy of Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, or even the Manson group. Perhaps you're aware of Synanon, a rehabilitation program that has since been coined one of the, quote, most dangerous and violent cults America has ever seen. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a cult researcher and professor of psychology and psychiatry, recognized 8 common methods used by cults: milieu control, what is sometimes called mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over person, and dispensing of existence. And they each serve their own purpose. Milieu control is basically the manipulation of a person's communication and environment, and it's one way that high control groups maintain authority over the individual. This method might be one of the most outwardly recognizable features in cults, as you can probably think of examples like the forceful relocation of the People's Temple members to Jonestown. Not only does this kind of authority affect a person's relationship with the world and society in general, but it also seeps into their internal world. Mystical manipulation, despite the nickname, does not necessarily have to be religious or spiritual in nature. What it's referring to is the utilization of manipulating a person's experience just so as to avoid criticism and support a specific belief or ideology chosen by the group's leadership. In layman's terms, it's a method of reframing to fit the narrative, essentially, of the group. This serves as a motivator for the unconditional justification and therefore obedience of authority. The demand for purity may also be a somewhat misleading term, as it's not necessarily related to any religious beliefs. It's more about having extremely rigid rules around what makes a good person or a bad person, what makes a healed person or sick person. You can insert other adjectives there, and they have a fixed idea of what is acceptable. These are more often than not extreme examples. There is no room for any gray area. That's the whole point. The idea is to utilize shame and fear as methods or tools for forced change. Confession is pretty much what you might have gathered. Using the defined standards of good and bad, or whatever adjectives you used, members are forced to admit or confess, whether truthfully and confidential or otherwise, their failures. I'm using the word failure here in the sense of whatever the group has determined to be a failure or a bad thing. It doesn't have to actually be, and it often isn't, based in any reality or law. The exploitation of these confessions are to maintain an authoritative presence in the minds of members. A group's sacred science, or ultimate truth, is the ideology which is enforced as being unquestionable and irreproachable. This is the truth and the law to be accepted and obeyed outright, and anyone outside of the group who otherwise questions it is outcast. Not only does this continue to encourage total compliance from people and discourage critical thought, but it also fosters a lot of mistrust of outsiders, aka other people in society and in the world. Loaded language can be described as the use of thought-stopping words or phrases that are unique to the group, and it further promotes the in-group feeling of acceptance within the cult. It also further discourages free and critical thought and contributes to the erasure of the individual. The concepts of doctrine over person and doctrine over existence sort of go hand in hand, in my opinion. The experience and the truth of the group are forced to take precedence over the beliefs and needs of the individual. Members of the group are not allowed to express individuality, whether that's through their beliefs and ideals or even down to the clothing that they wear or how they wear their hair. Anyone who does not follow the doctrines of the group is rejected. By default, any outsiders, meaning the rest of the world, is also rejected, thus creating a condition where the individual is completely dependent on the group. Notice that such heinous crimes like what happened in the cases of Charles Manson or Jim Jones are not explicitly mentioned in what is the widely accepted understanding of cults. Of course, we can recognize extreme examples like these. What makes cults so insidious is that the very foundation on which they're made, the core traits of a cult, are not so obvious. This is why it's so vital to know about these signs so that we can learn to recognize it before it gets to that point, before it's too late. Take, for example, Synanon. Though advertised as a life-saving resource with proven methods, it was found that the program was utilizing extremely rigid, punitive, and abusive tactics to treat substance abuse issues. Every method described by Dr. Lifton to be indicative of cult behavior, and every obstacle Erik Erikson identified to be detrimental to the developing brain, was used in this program. Eventually, Synanon dissolved due to bankruptcy, not because of the numerous accusations of abuse or even retaliation, believe it or not, and was recognized to be dangerous, but not before several spin-offs opened up, inspired by, and in some cases, founded by former members of Synanon, utilizing remarkably similar, if not the exact same practices. Some of these spin-offs including The Seed and Straight Ink. Yes, the same one mentioned earlier. The iterations have continued and so on and so forth, and here we are today, but not without lingering consequences. This isn't at all meant to imply that all programs are identical, or even that they look the same. The point is that the danger of high control groups, though not always obvious, exists prior to the first incident of actual crime, and it's imperative to recognize that in order to protect our youth. Now let's take a step away from such extreme, clearly deplorable examples. There exists a spectrum. In large part, programs aren't using evidence-based methods in treating the issues that youth are facing, despite their advertising. Many programs directly mimic methods used in Synanon and Straight Ink, wrapped in a more digestible title like Teaching Discipline and Tough Love. Even if they are using quote-unquote evidence-based methods such as applied behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, they are often misused and misapplied, if not intentionally, then through the lack of education, experience, and perhaps most importantly, lack of regulation. The individual needs of the child and the developmental capacities of the child are not taken into account, not to mention the viewpoints or opinions of the youth themselves. The children themselves generally have no say in their circumstances or are otherwise deceived or misled about the reality of the program. Programs will advertise accreditation, educational or otherwise, but upon closer evaluation, many of these accreditations come from organizations for which they pay for their membership and which stand to profit from the success of the programs, and equally so, stand to lose credibility from their demise. Furthermore, a federal accreditation standard for these alternative schools and programs does not exist, and state standards are scarce and insufficient at best. It's clear to me, even if unintentionally, the system is inherently set up in such a way that abuse and neglect can easily slip through the cracks. And it does. But how can we expect parents to just know all of this? There are no mandatory or free, for that matter, child development classes, let alone psychology courses for families. Granted, as mentioned earlier, the internet has played a huge part in making information like this more accessible, especially in recent years. This is why, A, I'm making this video, and B, it is so important that everyone does their own research, especially when it comes to making big life decisions like reaching out for support. So many families struggle to find the support that they need, and for many, the thought of the least restrictive environment for their child can be a terrifying one. Many worry about the repercussions, and this is valid. I want to emphasize, though, that children's rights do not equal unlimited freedom. Even adults don't have that. As with most things in life, there is a spectrum, and we are on the far side of one end in terms of the law. In 2022, the United States Government Accountability Office published a study along with a statement regarding the responsibility of the Health and Human Services Department in state-to-state child welfare, particularly referencing maltreatment in residential facilities. Their statement begins, and I quote, "State and local agencies are primarily responsible for helping to prevent abuse and neglect in youth residential facilities, but incidents continue to occur. Stakeholders and others told us that states could take additional steps to address maltreatment in these facilities." Obviously, there are financial implications in keeping these programs open and operating. To me, it almost sounds like the biggest motivator in taking action and actually making change was hearing from stakeholders, not hearing from the individuals with lived experience. The GAO, quote, recommended that the Department of Health and Human Services facilitate information sharing across states on promising practices to prevent and address abuse and neglect in youth residential facilities in 2022, because it really needed to be said, apparently. It's true, there is something to be said about the business of it all. Think about it. In some states, especially the more rural states, stand to benefit from the impact of these facilities on their economy. Not only does it bring more people in general, as most people are coming from out of state to these programs, but it also provides a significant amount of local jobs. Take the state of Utah, for example. In 2016, the University of Utah released a study titled "The Economic Impact of Utah's Family Choice Behavioral Healthcare Intervention Industry," which found that just the 59 programs that were studied in the year prior, there are many more in the state of Utah for context, provided, quote, over 6,400 jobs, $269 million in earnings, $423 million in state gross domestic product, and $22 million in state and local tax revenue in the year of 2015. If it isn't obvious at this point, I'll spell it out. States, who currently have the most regulatory power in this industry, benefit significantly from the presence of these facilities. In other words, they aren't exactly motivated to point out any problems. And we continue through the rabbit hole. Under the law, corporations are not human persons and cannot vote, so they shouldn't be able to influence election outcomes, right? Maybe you already know about this. Can think of some other examples. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision to constitutionally protect a corporation's right to spend unlimited funds on political campaigns they either endorse or renounce. This allowed programs to do just that, and they did, often donating to the campaigns of politicians who would support the continued operation of the program. For example, Mel Sembler, the founder of Straight Inc., who was active in donations to political campaigns even prior to this legislation, influencing even up to the highest officials. The troubled teen industry has its grip on everything, even Chick-fil-A, but that is a story for another video. I'll put it this way, more than likely you know someone who has been or has been affected by the TTI. And if you don't, now you do. When I was 14 years old, my parents made the decision based on recommendations from my psychiatrist and 2 educational consultants, who I have never met to this day, to send me to intensive treatment for my depression, anxiety, and PTSD, among behavioral issues related to those things. So 4 days after the new year in 2014, I flew from my home in Ohio to the northern Utah wilderness for therapy. 89 days of fear and filth later, I was then transported to another facility in Salt Lake City, which was a residential treatment center. And this is where I spent the next 16 and a half months. I lost my adolescence in the troubled teen industry, and I got trauma in its place. It took me several years, but I finally learned that I was far from alone and that my story was far from unique. I learned that there were so many people and even organized groups out there who had been fighting for the rights of kids in these programs long before even I was sent away. I even found legal and wellness resources for adult survivors like myself who are still dealing with the repercussions, whether it be days, years, or decades later. Many of the tragedies that occur at the hands of the industry aren't widely recognized in the media, and if they are, they certainly aren't given the attention that they truly deserve. You might have heard of Paris Hilton's experiences in the industry, but she's far from alone too. This is a problem that doesn't discriminate based on race, gender, religion, or economic status. The stories of abuse and neglect in these programs are endless. There is no single organization or agency that keeps track of the effects of these programs, so we can't say just how the industry is impacting us. And many programs don't even bother to attempt to follow up with clients, but several smaller studies have indicated its detrimental effects. Problems with interpersonal relationships, job instability, substance abuse, and various other risky behaviors, not to mention the long-term physical effects and sometimes disability. Aside from this, people are speaking up every day about their experiences in these programs. To be blunt, Google it. Search for a program name with the word survivors and you might be surprised at everything you find. Insert a collective sigh. Now that we have a mutual understanding of where we're starting, we can start looking at where to go. Obviously, there is a persistent need for youth support and for familial support, and obviously we can't just let youth have total say and control on how they live their lives. Society would be complete chaos, probably. As I mentioned earlier, acknowledging children's rights does not have to mean allowing children unlimited freedoms. There is a line. There needs to be a line. But why is the United States yet to ratify the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child? Because the ratification and acknowledgement of these human rights would undermine the industry as a whole. Regardless, evidence-based practices do exist. The Unsilenced organization defines evidence-based as, quote, having demonstrated effectiveness in scientific evaluations and randomized control trials, been assessed in large studies with diverse populations or through multiple replications by independent researchers, not by the developer of the model, aka someone who gains or profits from it, and having resulted in significant and sustained effects for a minimum of 6 months post-treatment. On their website, they have a long list of these safe evidence-based options, a lot of which includes community-based programs and methods. And of course, this video would be incomplete without any guidance or suggestions on where to go next. So here are my calls to action. First, if you are someone who has been through these programs and you're watching this, I see you. You deserved better. And there are resources for you, whether you're looking for justice or just looking for peace. I'll add a few links in the description of this video. Second, I implore parents and families to do the proper research prior to making the decision on placing their child. Be obnoxious about it, because you reserve the right to be obnoxious about the health and safety of your child. There are no dumb questions, and there are never too many questions. Thirdly, I implore you to learn about development. You might even learn a little bit about yourself, and more than likely, your child isn't the only one who needs some extra support right now, and that's okay. Lastly, I'd like to humbly ask you to listen to survivors, because we're called survivors for a reason. The voices of those who have lived experience will be a compass to a better future for our youth. We can learn from our history, and there is hope in a better future. Thank you for listening to my ranting opinions. Disclaimer, these are my opinions based on lived experience and an analysis of many, many resources as provided at the end of this video and possibly below. This is my first long form video, so we'll see how this turns out. If you're interested in getting actively involved in efforts to hold these places accountable, or even if you're just wanting to learn more, I'll also be adding those resources. If this helps even one family, it's been worth it. And thank you again for sticking around. Until next time, this has been Kira's Opinion, signing off.